Let's now return to the Falkland Islands, from where Matt Teale has been reporting throughout the 30th anniversary week.
I'm stood in front of Stanley Cathedral with its famous whalebone arch and the venue for the 30th anniversary commemoration service marking the liberation of these islands from Argentine forces. It was along this road, Ross Road, that British troops first arrived into Stanley, victorious of course, sparking those iconic shots where you could almost reach out and touch the relief that it was all over and that British forces had prevailed. Let's look back now at the highlights of the 30th anniversary of Liberation Day in Stanley. Standing room only as the national anthem is sung in Stanley Cathedral, just as it was 30 years ago as liberating troops gave thanks for their victory over Argentina. Around 30 veterans who arrived in the town in 1982 as the snow fell now braved blizzard conditions again as they proudly led the parade of today's servicemen and women past Victory Green. Falkland Islands patrol ship HMS Clyde, anchored in Stanley Harbour, provided the backdrop to the memorial service to honour the 255 military personnel and 3 islanders who were killed in the conflict. The ancestors of these young islanders go back generations. The roots go deep and the heavy snow didn't deter them from paying their own respects. Politicians from Gibraltar and Jersey, which paid for improvements in the town after the war, were also here to show solidarity with the islanders.
Let us then remember before God with profound humility and with unending gratitude those who died in the liberation of these islands.
Right, chest!
Wreaths were laid by the Governor, the Foreign Minister representing the government, and the Commander British Forces. And young islander Karen Minto laid a wreath on behalf of Lady Thatcher. After 2 days of dry weather, locals had hoped it would stay for this poignant occasion, but yet it served as a timely reminder of the conditions British troops endured 30 years ago. As British forces exercised their freedom of the Falklands, they were followed down Ross Road by veterans. They had done this once before, at the end of 74 days that changed so many lives. In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, there was plenty of clearing up to do here in Stanley, as you can imagine. There was also a garrison of troops to get used to. They didn't leave for another 3 years while the base at Mount Pleasant was being built. But the islands have certainly come a long way since then.
In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, the infrastructure of the tiny capital could barely cope, having to support thousands of troops, both British and Argentine. The streets were littered with the wreckage of war, abandoned weapons and spent ammunition.
The roads were in a pretty poor state even before we had, military trucks running over them. But it was chaotic. It was pretty bad for a year, 18 months.
It had been extensively pillaged, it had fallen apart. Its infrastructure was minimal to meet the then requirements, and of course we were utterly swamped, having become then a garrison, first a prisoner of war camp I suppose, and then a garrison town.
But given the trauma of occupation and the shock of the final battle before liberation, the recovery was remarkably swift. Troops were put up in 3 huge floating accommodation blocks called coastels on the eastern side of the town. The RAF decanted to Stanley Airport, where daily sorties were flown by Phantoms and Harriers. Islanders called the noise created by the jets the sound of freedom. It's still one of the few parts of the world where low flying is popular. The Falklands post-conflict suddenly became a much more attractive proposition to come and work.
The Falklands has changed largely as a result of communications, I would say. I mean, the access to the rest of the world that people then had on a weekly basis And the improvements in telecommunications and the introduction of television all changed people's lives. It made it a different sort of place. It was less parochial, if you like, and more people came and went. Of course, the influx of 10,000 soldiers, and then goodness knows how many thousands of contractors who came to support the reconstruction, was inevitably going to change the nature of Stanley in particular.
Infrastructure projects gained pace. The airfield at Mount Pleasant was completed in 1985, and work began on a network of tracks which made travel between settlements much less of a challenge. In the intervening years, fisheries licences have brought enormous wealth to the islands, but an even more lucrative source of income remains quite literally in the pipeline. This logistical supply base serving the oil industry is a tangible sign of things to come. It's something that could only have been dreamt about until post-war prosperity came to the islands. But envy of the island's potential rich harvest of resources is perhaps another reason why Argentina's claim to the islands has come so vociferously out of its box in this 30th anniversary year.
All of the noises that the Argentine government has made to the oil operators who've been very busy here drilling offshore since early January 2010, yes, it's perhaps been a little upsetting, but it hasn't been off-putting. Oil companies have been able to raise the funds necessary to go about their offshore oil and gas exploration, and as a consequence of that, one of the companies, Rockhopper Exploration, has been hugely successful.
Perennially, in many different venues, Mike Summers and his fellow Assembly members fight the diplomatic good fight on behalf of the Falklands.
We'll be there, and we'll be putting the Falklands case very strongly, that we're a community that have been here for many generations. I'm a 6th generation Falkland Islander. There are now people who can count 9 generations here. We're not a transplanted people. We're people who sort of grown and made this place what it is. And we do have the right to determine what sort of political future we should have, whether it's with the United Kingdom or with somebody else. That's the right of the people here to choose.
Despite the many military pundits in the UK warning against another Argentine invasion, islanders see that they're still well defended and believe there's only a storm of rhetoric rather than weapons to be weathered.
It's just so tiresome, you know, it's endless. It causes quite a lot of hassle economically with tourism and fisheries, and the oil they're threatening as well at the moment. So, but one day they might wake up and realise that we won't give in.
The conflict was 30 years ago. We need to move on. That's not an opinion you hear very much in the Falklands. Despite all the talk of prosperity, it never overshadows the innate sense of gratitude the islanders have for the British servicemen who restored their freedom. Richard Jones, Forces News in the Falkland Islands.
Well, let's leave the final word in this Liberation Week to the island's governor, Nigel Haywood. When I spoke to him at Government House, I started by asking what the legacy of the British victory here 30 years ago had been.
I think what you're seeing as you come here, which is the tremendous hope and optimism that everyone has for the future here. You'll have seen the new school buildings, the hospital, industries that have started up and grown over the last 30 years, the youngsters. So really, it's a future. They have a future. The islands have a future, and that's because of the events of 30 years ago.
Argentina has certainly ramped up the rhetoric over their claim to the Falkland Islands over the last few months. How do you react to that?
Much of what Argentina says is simply untrue. Much of their claim is around historical events of 180 years ago, and it's a misrepresentation of those events. So we're trying to make sure that the rest of the world understands that what Argentina is saying is not the case. But that's not as important as our main task, which is to make sure the world understands that the islands have been inhabited for 180 years by generations of Falkland Islanders, and they have the right to determine what form of government they live under, and nobody else has that right.
Do you think that the exchange of words between the Falklands and Argentina has now become something of a PR battle?
It is quite ironic, really, yes, the law of unintended consequences. But the main thing is that I think it has highlighted to us that there has been a need for the islanders to let the world know what the islands are really like. There are a lot of misconceptions out there, that the islanders are a transplanted population. They're kept in place by the military. I've even had people saying, oh, well, they don't speak Spanish, do they? We thought that they were really an Argentine population kept under control by the British military. There's lots of misconceptions out there about the islands, and those are best put right by people coming down and seeing the islands for themselves.
We're spending a lot of time this week looking at the past, at 30 years ago. What about the future for these islands?
There are so many areas that we're looking at to take forward the economy of the islands. The islanders themselves are incredibly optimistic about the future. Those educators in the UK are coming back to the islands. They see their future here. The future could hardly be brighter for the islands.
I did make the mistake yesterday of asking somebody whether the commitment to remain British was as strong as ever. And she suggested to me, did I want to leave with a black eye? I think that's fairly obvious.
You only have to drive around and look at the flags everywhere, the Union flags, Falkland Island flags, the Union flags are everywhere jointly. I think everyone sees themselves here as Falkland Islanders first, but they also see themselves as British second. And the celebrations we've just had for the Diamond Jubilee, for example, would leave nobody in any doubt at all about the Britishness of the islands.
Governor Nigel Haywood talking to me there. Well, that's pretty much it after a week of celebration and commemoration here in the Falklands. What I've learnt over the last few days is that while the Argentine claim to these islands is always there in the background, there's certainly a determination here that development goes on and that life goes on. And there's certainly a commitment from the British that the islanders' right to determine their own future is as strong as ever. I've also learnt that one thing you don't do here in the Falklands is question their desire to stay British. That's it from us, from Stanley. Goodbye.